College football will be played next week. This is not a drill, folks. Sound the alarms. College football is officially back. Week 0 is almost upon us, so why not go full marathon mode and predict every single week 0 game? And wouldn't you have it, that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. As always, welcome back to the channel, Capital F Football fans. I'm glad you're here. If you're ready to see my full predictions for week 0, go ahead and drop a like and a subscribe down below. And also go ahead and comment who you think will be winning these matchups in the comment section. I want to hear what you have to say. Be sure to drop that comment down below. And let's go ahead and start off my predictions with none other than the Aer Lingus Classic, the Ireland matchup this year between North Carolina and TCU. TCU is the odds-on favorite to win this matchup. They are a 7.5 point favorite at a neutral site, obviously in Ireland, and reasonably so in my opinion, because this is one of the best structured teams in all of the Big 12. Obviously, they do experience a lot of roster turnover this offseason. They returned just 58% of their production from last season, which is 107th in the sport. But do not be afraid, Horned Frog fans. You return some key contributors and bring in a ton of talent, namely the quarterback Jaden Craig, which if you have seen my offseason content, you would know I am super high on him. He was the Harvard quarterback last year, was very, very good in the starting role. He makes the jump to Fort Worth, Texas to be the next starting quarterback of the Horned Frogs, with, of course, the departure of Josh Hoover to Indiana. And on top of that, they return their RB1 from last year in Jeremy Payne. They return one of their top 2 wide receivers from last season in Jordan Dwyer. And on the offensive line, they return 3 starters from last year's unit. They also returned 4 starters on the defensive line, which could make the difference in this matchup, but I will get to that in a second. Overall, TCU is projected to be a very, very good team in the Big 12 this year, which you can obviously tell by the over touchdown spread in this game, but let's get to their opponent, the North Carolina Tar Heels. And what is there to say about this team that has not been said already? Bill Belichick is the head coach. If you have not heard, one of the more controversial head coaches in the sport right now. The defensive coordinator is his son, Steven Belichick, and they bring in another controversial figure within college football at offensive coordinator. It is Bobby Petrino. I actually really like that hire a lot. I think it could elevate them into potentially a bowl eligible team. Obviously, they were not that offensively last year. And the biggest thing for Bill Belichick and Bobby Petrino in Petrino's first year as the offensive coordinator is going to be the quarterback position, because they do not have a ton to work with in that department. They bring in Billy Edwards Jr., formerly of Maryland and Wisconsin, as well as Miles O'Neill, formerly the backup at Texas A&M. Billy Edwards is going to be the more experienced guy, but he's definitely going to have a ceiling at quarterback. Miles O'Neill is probably the more untapped quarterback, obviously with being the backup in the Colin Klein offense at Texas A&M last year. And other than the quarterback, they also do not return a ton of production from last year's squad. Ironically, the same percentage as TCU at just 58%, which is 105th in the sport. Offensively, they do return 3 starters on the offensive line. They return their top 2 running backs from last year, but their top 2 running backs both had under 100 attempts on the season, so not a lot to show there. But the biggest positive for this North Carolina team is going to be the defense under Steven Belichick. Last year, they were a very underrated unit. I believe they were top 25 in efficiency. They had some real game breakers, and I'm going to butcher this, Melkart Abu Jayodi. He racked up 12 tackles for loss, 11 sacks, and 5 quarterback pressures last season. Was a real talent on that defensive line that they're returning this season. They also have some quality production returning in the secondary, and they have a few key transfers at that linebacker position that I think could make a big impact this season. I might even say that North Carolina could have a slight defensive edge overall, but I think TCU has the clear edge on the offensive side of the ball, the clear edge at offensive line. I don't think they'll necessarily struggle with a ton of pressures given up for Jaden Craig. I think overall offensively, they're far and away the better team here. I will have TCU winning and covering the spread 31-23. And next, let's take a look at San Jose State going on the road to Los Angeles to play the USC Trojans. USC is a massive favorite in this game, obviously at minus 38.5. I think the winner of this matchup is probably going to be obvious. I'm not predicting an upset here. Sorry for the spoiler alert. The biggest question is going to be if USC can cover in this matchup. And in his time at USC, USC, Lincoln Riley is 5-0 in season openers. They're 4-1 against the spread in season openers. But the last time they played San Jose State, they did not cover. They won 56-28 in 2023, but that was with a considerably worse team in my opinion. Obviously, they had Caleb Williams, who was fantastic, but that team overall wasn't the best. And in my opinion, this USC squad in 2026 is going to be built to rout teams this upcoming season. They return a ton of key production on the offensive line, which should be dominant once again. They return a ton of key production at running back, which should be dominant once again. And they return an absolute phenom in Jaden Mayava, who should once again be a top 3 or top 4 quarterback in the Big Ten this year. And on top of all of that good stuff, San Jose State just projects terribly in my opinion. I am not high at all in the Spartans. And for the added cherry on top for my prediction, last year, USC played 2 G6 teams, Missouri State and Georgia Southern, and they won those matchups respectively 73-13 and 59-20, which would cover that 38.5 point spread that has been put on this game. So I am going to be taking USC to cover 62-10. And the next matchup we're going to be going over was originally going to be held in Brazil. Now it is back in the States. It's going to be at the University of Virginia, who takes on the NC State Wolfpack. Virginia is a 5.5 point favorite at home over NC State, and I think that's for good reason. Virginia's obviously coming into 2026 as the ACC runner-up. They returned 65% of that production from last season, which is 57th in the sport. Respectable number there. There's going to be a lot of inexperience on the offense overall. They lose Chandler Morris from last year. They lose their backup, Daniel Kalen, from last season, but they bring in 2 decent options at quarterback in Bo Pribula from Missouri and Eli Holstein from Pitt, so I don't think necessarily there will be a ton of worry at quarterback. And on top of that, this offense will be anchored by their heavily experienced offensive line. I think that unit's probably going to be the strongest of any unit overall in this matchup. And on top of that, the Cavaliers are going to return 5 defensive starters, and they're going to add 9 productive depth pieces on that defensive side of the ball as well. So I don't think there's a ton to worry about for Virginia this year. Obviously, like I said, the biggest is losing Chandler Morris, but they're going to be very, very strong on both sides of the ball once again this year. And that brings us to NC State, who was absolutely not solid on one side of the ball last year, and that was, of course, the defensive side of the ball. They were 118th in yards allowed per play last year. That is absolutely terrible if you cannot tell from that very, very high number in 118. But on the offensive side of the ball, they do return an absolute game wrecker at quarterback in CJ Bailey, who I'm predicting to be probably a top 3 quarterback in this conference this year. They return their RB2 from last year in Jaden Scott. They make 4 key additions at wide receiver to help benefit CJ Bailey in that regard. But like I said, the biggest question overall in this game is going to be if the NC State defense can improve and become at least average, because they were not even close to that last year, and it ended up costing them a few games. So in this matchup specifically, I do believe NC State will have the more explosive offense overall. But if you watched the channel last year, you know my mantra is that efficiency beats explosivity 99% of the time. I think Virginia is going to be anchored better on that offensive line and that defensive line. I don't think they'll be more explosive offensively. I don't necessarily believe they'll have huge game-wrecking talent on that front 7, but I do believe they have the edge there. And they also have the edge with this being a home game. Last year, Virginia went 6-1 at home, so that is a little cherry on top to this prediction. I'm expecting NC State to beat the spread, but I do have Virginia winning this matchup 28-27. In our next week 0 matchup that I'm covering is going to be Jacksonville State at the brand new FBS team, the North Dakota State Bison. And this is actually a surprise line. North Dakota State is a touchdown favorite at home in their first FBS matchup in program history. And that's surprising because if you kept up with the G6 last year, you know, Jacksonville State was the CUSA runner-up. They were a very, very good squad last year, ran the ball at a very efficient rate. But North Dakota State is going to be a team that's built to succeed at the FBS level. They've been one of the best FCS teams for over a decade at this point. The most important thing for this North Dakota State team is they returned 3 offensive line starters and 4 defensive line starters from last year's squad. That was very, very solid to say the least. At quarterback, Nathan Hayes is going to take over the full-time gig. He's going to look to have a breakout year in that offense that averaged over 5 yards per carry as well. So like I said, this North Dakota State team is going to be very efficient on the ground. They're going to play bully ball overall on the defensive side of the ball. They're not going to give up easy yards in the running game, but they are facing a Jacksonville State team that also averaged over 5 yards per carry last season. But from that offense last year, they lose Cam Cook, who was one of, if not the best running back at the group of 6 level last year. And that leads me to say the biggest question mark for this Jacksonville State team is, can they replace Cam Cook? That might even be disrespectful because I don't think Cam Cook is a guy that you can just replace, but let me reach into my Moneyball bag. Can they replace him in the aggregate? That will be the biggest thing for the Jacksonville State Gamecocks in this matchup, but also on the defensive side of the ball, they have 2 key pieces to look out for in their defensive tackle, Curtis Perry, and their linebacker, Max Sanders. I think defensively, Jacksonville State will be pretty solid once again, but overall, my biggest mismatch in this matchup is the fact that Jacksonville State is going to want to run the ball. Caden Creel at quarterback was not very efficient overall as a passer, was very efficient as a runner, but how much of that can be replicated now that they don't have an absolute phenom at running back? I guess we'll have to wait and see, but I think North Dakota State is built to limit this rushing attack, maybe more so than Jacksonville State was last year on the defensive side of the ball. And if Vegas is already willing to predict North Dakota State as a touchdown favorite at home, I'm willing to hear them out. I have North Dakota State winning this matchup 28-20. And that brings us to another new FBS team in Sacramento State. They go on the road to Ypsilanti, Michigan to take on the Eastern Michigan Eagles. Unfortunately for Sacramento State, they do not have the same hype wins that are at North Dakota State sales this year. They are a 9.5-point dog on the roads against Eastern Michigan, who retains a solid amount of production from last season, 62% to be exact, which is 76th in all of college football, which for a group of 16 for a MAC team is going to be pretty solid overall. On top of that, they weren't bad at all on the offensive side of the ball last year. They returned their quarterback in Noah Kim, who had turnover issues last year, but was overall very solid. The biggest thing for this Eastern Michigan team is going to be that they were just bad defensively last year. Can they take a step forward with the new hire at defensive coordinator, as well as retaining top 30 production on the defensive side of the ball? If they can turn into just an average defensive unit, I think they could be one of the best teams in the MAC overall, just based on how a lot of those rosters have shaken out over the course of this offseason. And for Sacramento State, they read a lot more like what you would expect stereotypically from a team that jumps up from the FCS level. They don't really have an established identity returning from that 2025 unit. They have a very poor talent composite compared to most other G6 and Power 4 teams. They have very little returning production from that 2025 unit, and they don't have a ton of quality transfers that really give me a ton of hope for this unit overall in 2026. So I am going to end up predicting Eastern Michigan to win and cover in this one 31-20. And our next matchup is actually going to be a rematch from last year's week 0. It is Hawai'i at Stanford. Stanford is a 5.5-point favorite in this game, but if you think back to last year, they actually lost this game in Hawaii. Some would say that was a shocking loss for Stanford. I actually predicted it in last year's video. If you don't believe me, go ahead and check it out. I am absolutely telling the truth there. And overall, Stanford has been a team that hasn't done much since winning the ACC. This year, they bring in an alumni in Tavita Pritchard as their new head coach, but there are still a ton of question marks overall on this offense. The quarterback position specifically looks pretty bleak. They retained Dylan Rizk from last year. I think that's how you pronounce it, Rizk. They returned Davis Warren at quarterback, who notably was one of those terrible quarterbacks from that 2024 Michigan team. They bring in true freshman Michael Mitchell Jr., and they also return Charlie Myrer from last year's squad as well. So safe to say there is not a ton to work with at the quarterback position, but they do return Micah Ford, who was a very serviceable running back for the Cardinal last year. They also return 4 offensive line starters, which should benefit Micah Ford a ton. And something that I think is being very undervalued in this matchup is just how underrated Stanford appears, at least on paper, on the defensive side of the ball. They return a high 4-star edge rusher from the 2024 class in Benedict Yume. The linebacker position specifically looks very, very strong. They return key starters from last year's squad in Matt Rose, Tavara Tafiti, and Ernest Cooper, who combined last year for over 70 solo tackles, 20 tackles for loss, and 8 sacks at the linebacker position. They also return some key contributors in the secondary in Brandon Nicholson and Jay Green, who combined for over 45 solo tackles, 4 tackles for loss, 1 sack, 12 pass defenses, and 2 interceptions. So I do think Stanford will at least be a bit stronger on that defensive side of the ball. But for the Hawaii Rainbow Warriors, there's one name to think about and one name only, and that is going to be the MVP from last year's game in Micah Alejado. He's one of the best quarterbacks overall returning at the Group of 6 level. It was rumored that he could make a jump to a Power 4 program even. That's just how good he was overall last season for the Rainbow Warriors. On top of that, they returned 3 starters on the offensive line to help him out, but overall they weren't great defensively last year, which does give me a bit of pause going into this game, because I do think there is a substantial chance that Stanford is considerably better on the offensive side of the ball this year with bringing in Tavita Pritchard, who has served as an offensive coordinator in years past, served as the quarterbacks coach for the Washington Commanders, who have had a very, very solid quarterback in Jaden Daniels. I know he's been mired in controversy recently, but that's neither here nor there. I'm actually predicting the home edge and the new offensive scheme to play a huge impact on this game for Stanford. And on top of that, I think defense will make all the difference in this matchup. And like I said, Stanford's going to have a very solid defense in my opinion. I predict Stanford to beat Hawaii in the rematch. I predict them to cover, and I predict the final score to be 24-17. And for our second to last matchup of this video, it is New Mexico State traveling to Tallahassee to play the Florida State Seminoles. This is going to be another no-brainer. I'm obviously going to have Florida State to win this matchup, but the spread is surprisingly low for two teams that are this far apart in terms of talent composite. 31.5 is the spread in favor of the Seminoles, and that's going to be largely in part due to the fact that this offense is a huge question mark for Florida State in 2026. They lose their offensive coordinator to retirement from last year in Gus Malzahn. They lose their quarterback in Thomas Castellanos. They return 0 starters at offensive line, but they do add 2 key running backs in Trey Wisner, formerly of Texas, and Jermari Sands, formerly of FAU, as well as retaining All-American wide receiver Deuce Robinson as well. The biggest question mark for this team is, of course, how effective they can be on the offensive side of the ball with that new offensive coordinator and with a question mark at quarterback. The 2 quarterbacks who are most in the mix this year are Ashton Daniels, formerly of Auburn. Wasn't great as a passer last year in his few appearances there, but definitely had a ton of upside as a runner. And also Dean DeNoble, who jumps up from Lafayette from the FCS level, who is very, very solid, very serviceable at quarterback. Not quite sure who wins the job there. We will have to see. But with that said, the defense is going to be the strong suit for this team. They retained Tony White at defensive coordinator for the second consecutive year. Last year, they had some woes in terms of how lucky they were. They were very solid overall, just really got unlucky a lot of times, and that's mainly why they ended up finishing so poorly in conference play and overall. But overall, on that defensive side of the ball, they retained 74% of their production from last season, which is 24th overall. They returned 6 key starters on that front 7. They also add some talent. They also add some key talent from the Group of 6 and Power 4 level in that secondary, and guys like Nehemiah Chandler, CJ Richard, and Mekhi Jones, formerly of Duke last season. I do believe the Florida State defense will be able to limit this New Mexico State offense, which might not be bad overall by the season's end, but I am not super high on them in week 0 against a Power 4 opponent. Like I alluded to throughout this prediction, I think the defense carries this Florida State team. Being a Power 4 team, I think Florida State's stamina and depth will absolutely outpace that New Mexico State team, and I do have Florida State winning and covering 42-10. And the last matchup of this marathon, and arguably the most exciting one on paper all around, it is Memphis at UNLV. UNLV is going to be a 5.5 point favorite at home. They do lose Mountain West Player of the Year in Anthony Calandria last season, but they bring in Jackson Arnold to maybe not replace him, but definitely be able to pick up right where Calandria left off. I think Jackson Arnold is going to benefit a lot from that Dan Mullen offense, especially so because they bring back Jet Thomas at running back, who is one of the best running backs overall in the Group of 6 this year. UNLV is going to be the favorite to win the Mountain West because of that talent level, because of that coaching level that Dan Mullen brings with him. The biggest question though for this UNLV team, and what I think could be the difference between them finishing where they did last year and potentially being the Group of 6 representative in the college football playoff, is can they improve on the defensive side of the ball? Last year they averaged 6.1 yards allowed per play on the defensive side of the ball, which was 117th in the country. Safe to say that's not going to cut it if you want to, like I said, compete towards the top of the Group of 6, potentially be the Group of 6 college college football playoff bid this year. I do think they end up improving in that regard, but it is obviously going to be a wait and see there. But for Memphis, there are going to be a ton of question marks everywhere because they bring in Charles Huff. They rebuild that roster. Overall, they return just 2 starters from last year's squad. They add 15 starters through the portal. And of those transfers, the quarterback is going to be the biggest question mark. We don't know exactly who is going to be the starter in 2026, but I think there are a couple good options. Namely, Marcus Stokes comes up from the Division II level, kind of like a Trinidad Shambles last year, but let me pump the brakes there. I am a big fan of Marcus Stokes, but they also have Aaron Noland, who transferred from Ohio State to South Carolina last year, didn't get a ton of burn for the Gamecocks last year, and now transfers from South Carolina to Memphis. That, like I said, is going to be the biggest question mark, but virtually everywhere else, they're going to be very solid, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Huff imports a ton of standouts from that Southern Miss defense last season, including an edge rusher in Jamon Tapp, who was one of the best overall in the group of 6 last year, racked up over 19 solo tackles, 12 tackles for loss, and 8 sacks for the Golden Eagles last year, and a ton of key contributors at defensive back, namely Anthony Richard Jr., Amir Foster, and Ian Foster. Those 3 combined for 60 solo tackles, 6 tackles for loss, 1 sack, 17 pass defenses, and 8 interceptions. And the biggest question mark for Memphis over the past few seasons, formerly under Ryan Silverfield, is can the coaching step up and elevate this roster, which will be naturally one of the best rosters in all the group of 6, into an AAC champion, into a potential G6 CFP representative. And I'm not quite sure they're capable of doing that in year 1. I definitely like the hire Charles Huff. I definitely think they can get there. But for this matchup, I'm going to go with the team that has less unknowns, the team that has more continuity from last season. That is, of course, going to be the UNLV Rebels. I have UNLV winning this matchup 35-31. That's going to wrap up my predictions for week 0. But, of course, let me know what you think of these matchups down below. Are there going to be any big upsets? Am I predicting one of these matchups just completely far off? Drop a comment down below on what you think. And be sure to tune in next week to see my best bets for week 0. And I hope to see you there.